Hi everyone, welcome to the TriEssence martial art channel. Another episode of Fact or Fiction. This will be episode 12, I believe. Whereas if you read the title, you will know we're going to be talking about whether or not is wrestling useful in the olden day battlefield. And in this case, I refer particularly to Chinese olden day battlefield. Right? I didn't write that in the name of the video because that makes the title too long. I'm trying to make the title shorter, but I'm not going to be talking about Western battlefield. I'm going to be focusing on the Chinese historical battlefield. Now, following my previous videos of fact or fiction, some of you might think I actually have it out for the wrestling guys. Well, truth be told, I'm actually not. I don't have anything against Chinese wrestling. It's just that I like to make videos with similar theme, close to each other, so that you can logically go through each video and create a logical link. That's why I'm, at this stage on Fact or Fiction series, I am focusing on Chinese wrestling topics. Now, the reason I decided to make this topic is actually because of a recent, by recent I mean in the past maybe 5 or 6 years, of people in China claiming that Chinese wrestling is the most useful battlefield empty-hand martial art. Now, the reason this is even a topic of discussion is basically originate around the time where Xu Xiaodong, right, the famous MMA coach. Hopefully by now everyone will know who he is. If you don't, you can just do a quick Google and you'll probably find out. When he fought the fake self-proclaimed Taiji master Wei Lei, after he defeated him, and then later on went on to defeat a couple of other self-proclaimed Chinese traditional martial art masters, it kind of made the Chinese traditional martial art community look bad. And some people in the Chinese martial art community can't take that, right? They don't have a strong heart. So they try to find excuses for themselves by saying that, Chinese traditional martial art is not designed for the ring, and therefore we can't beat you in the ring. But, Chinese traditional martial art is designed for olden day military battlefield. We will kill you if you were back in the days on the battlefield against us. Obviously, this saying is bogus. I mean, there are some truth to it, very little. The truth about that is basically Chinese traditional martial art, Quanfa, like we said in my previous video, did have its root source influenced by military training. But the Quanfa systems by themselves were not designed for the battlefield. So these guys who claim that they basically know absolutely nothing about Chinese history. But because of this massive claim, Xu Xiaodong and people from his camp then made an opposing claim, saying that Chinese traditional martial art was never used in the olden day battlefield. This is actually historically correct, but they didn't stop there. On top of that, they said, however, Chinese wrestling is a real important hand-to-hand training that people used back in the days on the battlefield. And because of Xu Xiaodong's people saying this, then a lot of other Chinese wrestlers start to also say this and claim that, Chinese wrestling is a king of empty-hand combat on the battlefield, which led to a lot of internet posts and articles like the one that you see now, where it read 古战场上的无冕之王摔跤武器就在我脚下. So what that read is basically hands down the king of the olden day battlefield dash wrestling, weapon is my foot. Obviously, he probably refers to empty hand because obviously if you include weapon, then wrestling is no way to be important at all. And there are also other articles such as the one you see now, which read 为什么古时候重视摔跤、脚底这些原始又花式不多的武术，反而不是很抬举现在的武术. What this means is someone asking why back in the old days they focus on wrestling, the more primitive and less flowery combat compared to the modern Quanfa or Chinese traditional martial arts. So naturally, both of these posts and many more that I don't care to show you all of them are written by people who don't actually know enough about Chinese history. Which is why I've decided to make a video about this. I'm not sure if this is actually a common belief in the West, but I decided, most of you probably will find this, hopefully will find this topic interesting as well. So I know that some of you find my videos excessively long and don't have the patience to sit through them. And unfortunately, for me to actually discuss the topic fully, the videos do end up being that long. But if you don't have the patience to watch this, well, if you want a quick answer, is that according to the way I see it, sometime in the Chinese dynasty era, wrestling were used to train troops. But I do not think it's any important or useful in the olden day battlefield, at least from Han Dynasty onwards. So that is my short answer. If you don't have the patience to search through the video, then there is your answer. For the rest of the video, I'll be basically providing evidence and discussion to prove my point. So if you don't want to watch the rest, you can stop now, and thanks for watching. Now the rest of you who are still watching this video, thanks for carrying on, and I'm gonna hopefully provide an interesting argument against those who claim that wrestling were very important in the olden day battlefield. So before we start, let's quickly talk a little bit about history, right? I'm by no means an expert in history or a self-proclaimed historian. As this was mentioned before, I am not a historian. I'm a practical Chinese martial art practitioner. However, given how much misinformation is floating around regarding Chinese martial art history, it kind of forced me to look into it to see what actually really is the truth. But even then, my time is limited, so I can't look at all the sources. So I'm not always correct. And if you have some better source, you are welcome to discuss with me about it. Comment below or probably message me. It's all fine. Now, when talking about history, there are usually two ways that we can learn of history. Firstly is through historical record, and secondly is through archaeology discoveries. Now, between the two, obviously the archaeology discovery is more reliable than record. Because records are written by people who can make mistake, who can purposely write incorrect information. So just because something written in history doesn't make it completely true. However, if we don't have anything else, for example, if we haven't dug up historical relics that proves the theory or counterprove the theory, then most of the time we have to go by the historical record. However, besides these two important ways, record and archaeology discovery, there's another thing that's very important that people often overlook, and that is the importance of common sense. Now, obviously, common sense is a pretty broad stroke. It can mean a variety of things, and not all the common sense are correct, especially when talking about the historical period. If you don't know the context and the background information, then often what you seem to not be common sense are actually common sense under that context. So common sense isn't always reliable. But I'm just going to give you a quick example of when common sense does prevail. Recently, I was having a discussion with my Xinyi friend in China over WeChat. And he was talking about how, according to the historical record, Yue Yun, the eldest son of Yue Fei, one of the most famous generals of Southern Song Dynasty, so his eldest son, Yue Yun, who also went to battle with him, he supposedly wielded two mace or two hammer, and the hammer, according to the official historical record, weighs 80 斤. Now, 80 斤, basically during the Nan Song, right, the Southern Song Dynasty, is about 680. 1 jin equal to 683 grams. But let's just make it easy. So 80 jin more or less weighs about 40 kilo. At the time, I told him, but that just can't happen. We know for a fact that humans have limitations when it comes to strength and muscle structure. And conventionally, whether it's in China or in Europe, medieval time, a battle mace and a warhammer weighs around 1 to 2 kilo at max. Maybe some really strong champion could use maybe a 3 or 4 kilo, but it doesn't go beyond that. So for someone to be wielding 40 kilo mace, whether it's one that's 40 or even two, which is make it easier, but still 20 on each hand, it's just simply too much. And it's not just the fact where you can pick it up, you're able to pick it up and swing it and constantly and continuously swing it through the whole duration of the battle. And under that common sense, it's just not possible. But my friend's argument is that it is written in the official record, and therefore it must be true. So I looked a bit deeper into it, and then found the discrepancy. The record of Yue Fei Zhuan, right, where it's recorded information about his son Yue Yun's mace's weight. Yue Fei Zhuan was written by his grandson Yue Ke, who was born 40 years after Yue Fei and his eldest son were executed for false treason. Which means the person who wrote the record had never seen the grandfather, and in fact his own father, which is the youngest son of Yue Fei, was still a kid when Yue Fei and his eldest son were executed. So even he probably don't remember exactly the weight of his eldest uncle's mace. And because the person who falsely accused Yue Fei of treason, namely the minister of Song Dynasty at the time called Qing Hui, his son was head of historical record. He basically unpurposely omitted, he did not record much about Yue Fei and his son, which is why during Yue Fei's grandson's era, when Yue Fei's status of treason has been reversed by the next emperor of Song, they decided to write him his official record. But his son, actually his grandson, right, Yue Ke, don't have much actual factual information to work with, which is why he probably came up with this figure, highly exaggerated. From this short example, you can see that sometimes records are not that trustworthy if it goes severely against common sense or known physics, right? Record can change due to human interpretation, but physics can't. Physics is the law of the universe. And therefore, in today's discussion, we're also going to be relying a bit on common sense. The reason for this is because I've looked through the historical record as much as I can find, probably not nearly everything, but a good portion of it, that talked about Chinese wrestling throughout various important dynasties. And besides the early Xizhou Dynasty, which is one of the very early dynasties, where there was actual record about saying that wrestling was used to train troops, and then I found another record about training military with wrestling in the Ming Dynasty, which is one of the second last dynasty to exist in China, fairly recent, about 500 years ago. Whereas Eastern Zhou is about more or less 3,000 years ago, just to put things in perspective. So between 3,000 years ago to about 500 years ago, that time period in between, I can't find any record mentioning of military purpose of Chinese wrestling. Which is why, in order to get to the bottom of this, we have to start using logical thinking and common sense. But do keep in mind that because I'm predominantly using logic and common sense, it is not factual history. This is only an opinion or one theory or a hypothesis that's coming from me. So it doesn't mean it's completely true. However, at the end of this video, hopefully you can make your own decision based on the fact and reasons that I provided on this topic of discussion. So firstly, let's look through some of the historical records that I managed to dig up regarding wrestling. So the first record is from the Western Zhou Dynasty, right? More or less about 3,000 years ago. It's in a record called Li Ji Yue Ling. In it, it says, 蒙东之月，天子乃命将帅讲武，习射御角力. So what this record is saying is that during the winter months, the king of Western Zhou Dynasty commanded his general to train troops in 射 referring to archery, 御 refers to controlling of a chariot, and 角力, which is wrestling. So this is the one record where I managed to find where it explicitly said that they're actually training wrestling for the military of the Western Zhou Dynasty. So this is often be referenced as the earliest record that Chinese military has been training wrestling. However, here is some details that people tend to miss, is that they are grouping 射御, right? So that is basically archery, chariot control, or how to control, drive a chariot, if you will, and 角力 wrestling together. Now we know for a fact that the first two, archery and chariot handling, are exclusive to nobility. So if they're saying that the general was commanded to do martial lecturing on these three practices, then chances are he's lecturing, people from the noble class, the nobility class, which you can interpret it almost like the knights of the medieval Europe. And they're not actually lecturing the common civilian, who are the foot soldiers, if you will. And furthermore, 讲武 lecturing, martial lecturing, it doesn't necessarily mean military training. It could just mean a martial contest or some kind of, activity they do to keep fit. So this actually isn't completely precise on showing that if, wrestling is trained with the military was intended for warfare or not. But it also doesn't explicitly say it isn't. So at least, for all fairness, we can assume that this is the earliest record that the nobility of the Western Zhou Dynasty do train wrestling at some point. However, this then gets contradicted by what we know as the sixth art, 六艺, of the Western Zhou Dynasty, which is heavily preached at the time as the six things that a gentleman, right, 君子, which you can basically see as nobility, has to master. So the sixth art of the Western Zhou Dynasty for nobility is 礼, 乐, 射, 御, 书, 术. 礼 is basically mannerism and social structure. Nobility, they have a very complex social structure and what kind of manners you have to present depending on your social class and who you are interacting with. So that is 礼. 乐 refers to music and dance. These two are very important because they are used for ancestral ceremonies. And back in those days, ancestral ceremony is one of the most important things for the kingdom. Next is archery, which has always been one of the most important ways of combat in Chinese history. Since the early days when bow and arrow were invented, it has always been the most important means of warfare. Because if you can shoot somebody from far away, why would you go closer and do melee combat? Next is chariot handling. It's very important because during the Zhou Dynasty, as well as the spring, autumn, and warring state, the main army consists of chariots that we'll discuss at a later point in this video. So that's also a very important skill. The next one, 书, is basically literacy, being able to read and write and know about the important classical books at the time. And lastly is 数, referred to mathematics, but also include a 周易, which is a means to fortune telling, but they do fortune telling through mathematical calculation rather than looking through a crystal ball. So these are the six arts that the nobility had to master during the Zhou Dynasty. And what we can see here is that there are no wrestling, which, like I said, contradicts that record that we mentioned earlier, where they talk about the martial lecturing, including archery, chariot, and wrestling. And when we compare the two, it makes one wonder just how important wrestling were during that time. Well, just during that one particular emperor's time, where was one king's time, where that record was written, that they actually trained, the nobility did train wrestling, or was it trained throughout, but they neglected to include that in the sixth art of nobility. Personally, I lean towards that wrestling wasn't that important, therefore it was included. But of course, there are no definitive evidence here, so people who support wrestling can believe the other side of the argument, and that's totally fine. And we're going to look further on to the next record. Next record is from 汉书 武帝纪, which is basically the record of Han Wuti, one of the most famous military emperor of Han Dynasty. So he's the one that beat back the Hans from Chinese borders. So in his record it says 三年春做脚底戏300里皆来观, which means on the third year's spring they had a big event where they had a wrestling play, right? 戏 is like a play. People from 300 miles radius has come to watch this event. Now notice that this is no longer talking about military, but talking about wrestling as a competition and as a civilian event. And I have not able to find any record of military training on wrestling during the Han Dynasty. But like I said, I'm not a professional historian, so I might have missed some record. But if there were a lot, then I should have been able to find some. The fact that I couldn't find any suggests that either there isn't any, or if there is, it's very scarce. And if it's very scarce, then one have to wonder just how popular was it, or how important was it to their military training if it didn't actually write all that much about it. So over here, you can see a pictorial depiction of this Jiao Di Xi that was recorded in the Han Dynasty historical record. And if you look closely in the picture, you can see that both of the participants are wearing a mask that resembles an ox. The reason for this is that according to legend, Jiao Di, right, the ancient form of Chinese wrestling, was first practiced by the arch-enemy of the Yellow Emperor, and known as Chiyou. Now, according to legend, Chiyou actually has horns and resembles an ox face but a human body. And you can see that what this is considered a myth rather than history. And him and his people are excelled at wrestling, and that's where Jiao Di supposedly come from according to myth and legend. So during the Han Dynasty, they basically have this kind of Jiao Di Xi. Jiao Di means wrestling. At the time, I've explained in my previous video, Xi is like a play, and they'll reenact almost like a story of that prehistorical ancient legend, which is why in this picture you see that the participants are wearing ox mask. So from this we can see that the record about wrestling in the Han Dynasty is a mixture between sport and some kind of theatrical play or reenactment. It's not actually a pure competitive sport. There's an element of entertainment rather than, so there's a strong element of entertainment mixed with sport rather than some kind of military training that's purely meant for warfare. Next, let's take a look at the Tang Dynasty record. So here is an interesting thing, because according to the wrestling people, that the Tang Dynasty has also used wrestling or sumo at the time, like I've mentioned in my previous video, xiangpu, but they also are called Jiao Di in this particular record. They've been using it to train the Tang Dynasty military. What is true that during the Tang Dynasty, 左神策军 and 右神策军, basically they are the close guards of the emperor. They are well versed in the practice of Jiao Di or xiangpu, or the Chinese wrestling of the Tang Dynasty. But these troops are not the ones that goes out to fight war. They're more like bodyguards than military soldiers. And it kind of makes sense that the personal guard and close guard of the emperor would require some form of hand-to-hand combat, because assume that an assassin that came to assassinate the emperor, then it would be at close quarters, so maybe there's enough time to draw a weapon or to use a polearm. In that case, wrestling does come in handy. Although I don't recall any incident where there's actually an assassin during the Tang Dynasty against the emperor where wrestling were used. But it kind of makes sense why they're required to practice wrestling. And another thing that people often don't pick up in the historical record is that these close guard of emperor are also responsible for entertaining the emperor at times, where they would do similar to the Han Dynasty. They will have a play or a match of wrestling, and the emperor will watch it for entertainment value, because the emperor of the Tang Dynasty, they really like this kind of entertainment, because back then there's no TV or YouTube or TV series or Game of Thrones. So therefore, wrestling is one of the most entertaining events for the emperor and for civilians. And being the close guard, they often been called up to do wrestling when the emperor is bored. And we can basically see that in this particular historical record from the Tang Dynasty called 太平广记, scroll number 500, 玉堂闲话. In it says, 光启年中，左神策军四军军使王辩出镇镇武，至宴，乐戏祭毕，乃命剿敌. So what this says, during the year of 光启, 左神策军 is the left army of the close guard of the emperor. 四军军使, you can interpret that as the 4th squadron's captain, Wang Bian, his name. He was sent to be garrisoned in a place called Zhenwu. And upon his arrival, he held a feast. And upon this feast, after music and theatrical dance and play were finished, he asked people to do wrestling. So again, this is a record we can clearly see that wrestling has been practiced and used as a form of entertainment, not as a form of battle tactic. Here's another record from the Tang Dynasty called 明皇杂录. In it, it says 每次筵宴、教坊、大乘山车、汉船、巡撞、走索、酒剑、脚底、戏马、斗鸡、诸戏. So basically what this roughly saying is that whenever there is a feast or a celebration, there's going to be a list of entertainment, which include having boat that is on land, people walking on tight ropes. 南索酒剑 is like some kind of sword play circus act. 脚底 is wrestling. 戏马 is basically horse circuit act. 斗鸡 is rooster fighting. So you can see that in this record it also lists wrestling as a type of entertainment among other circuit acts during the Tang Dynasty's celebration. Now here's another record that was written during the end of Tang Dynasty to the early stage of the 5th Dynasty era, 五代. It's a book called 角力记. It's basically a record particularly about wrestling, 角力. So in this it reads, 鄱阳荆楚之间，五岳盛极，水系则竞渡，街坊则相扑为乐. Which also says that between the land of Poyang and Jingchu, during May they have a celebration or gathering where they will have some kind of game that they play with water. They will have some kind of boat race, and among the streets they will have sumo as a type of entertainment. Remember here, sumo 相扑 is the same as 角力 because this is actually written in the book called 角力记, which record about wrestling. So sumo and wrestling, they are basically the same thing at the time. So we basically looked at 3 separate records during the Tang Dynasty that talks about wrestling as a form of entertainment and not as a form of military training or military tactic. Now I'm not saying that the troops during the Tang Dynasty are not trained in wrestling, but other than the emperor's close guard, 左右神策军, I can't find any record that the actual military that they used to fight foreign invaders are well versed in wrestling, and there's certainly no record of wrestling in any of the military tactical books, which we'll talk in more detail later on. Now in the Song Dynasty, it's pretty much like the Tang Dynasty. It also pretty much have record about 相扑 or 脚底 or 角力 wrestling, used as a form of entertainment and competition, and the winners get prizes, but there isn't really any clear record of it explicitly being used as a way of military training and used to fight invaders. For example, during the Southern Song Dynasty, there's a record called 孟良录. The 20th scroll, 脚底 means wrestling. In it, it says, 若论护国寺，南高峰，露台争交，须则诸道州郡，壁立高墙，天下无对者，方可夺其赏. It's basically saying that during that time there's a very prestigious tournament, and only the selected few from each province and areas that have the best strings is able to win and receive the handsome reward. So from up to here we can see that from the Han Dynasty all the way to the Song Dynasty, there are plenty of record about wrestling being used as a form of entertainment / competitive sport, but not as a very important military training for the soldiers. And during the Yuan Dynasty, we know that Mongolians, they love wrestling, but whether it is actually used in their warfare, we'll be talking at a later stage. Now when we get to the Ming Dynasty, this is where things get interesting, because I actually did manage to find record about the Ming military trained in wrestling. In the record of 明史记本末江兵兼佞, in it says, 常于西内练兵，令江兵率兵入，学营阵，效骑射，或时为脚底之戏. So basically what this is saying is that it's basically the Ming historical record of one of the military personnel called Jiang Bin. And it's basically saying that Jiang Bin was tasked with training the military, and the training include learning formation, learning riding and archery, and sometimes 做脚底之戏. Basically, they do wrestling. So this has been one of the most important evidence that the wrestling people has provided to show that the Ming Dynasty military trains in wrestling. If you ask any of them to provide proof, this is most likely the quote that they will provide you. And without a doubt, this record definitely shows that the Ming military, at least some of it, were trained in wrestling. However, the interesting thing here is that the last sentence where it talks about wrestling, it says 或时为脚底之戏. 或 is else or other, 时 means sometime. So the two subjects before that, 学营阵, which is learning formation, 校骑射, practicing riding and archery, those are, according to this text, the main focus. And then sometimes or occasionally 做脚底之戏. So that means it only occasionally do wrestling. And the other interesting here is that it says 脚底之戏. 脚底 is wrestling. 戏 is basically a play. So what one can actually interpret this as is that they train in formation, riding and archery, and occasionally they also play with wrestling. And this actually could suggest that during that record time, in that particular military camp, they use wrestling as a form of entertainment among the soldiers rather than actual means to learn how to win in battle. Now again, I'm not saying that you'll never ever use wrestling skills in battle, but according to the record, wrestling doesn't really sound like something they train purely for the military purpose. It's rather like an entertainment the soldiers do to keep themselves busy besides training. And of course, in doing so, they're still training their physical stamina, strength, reflex, which are all valuable to winning a war. But even though this is one of the main records that wrestling supporters provide to prove their case, in my opinion, it's suggested as a form of extra activity rather than one of the most important military training used during the Ming Dynasty's military training method. And lastly is the Qing Dynasty, and we'll need to look at any record to know that the Qing people, the Manchurians, especially the royalties, they love wrestling. It's a habit they picked up from the Mongolian people back when they were interacting with them. And of course, they have their own special team of imperial wrestlers that they would have competition every year, etc., etc. So we don't need to go into details there. But whether or not the Qing military troops are well versed in wrestling is again questionable. And even if they do practice it, do they do it for entertainment purpose or for pure military purpose? That is also questionable. So up to this point, we can basically see through the most important dynasties throughout Chinese history that we can easily find record about wrestling being used for entertainment purpose, but we can't actually find them being used for pure military purpose. And I've looked through, again, I'm not a historian, so I haven't looked thoroughly, but I've looked through all the important Chinese military manuscripts, and I don't remember any of them particularly emphasizing on the training of wrestling and its tactical usage in battlefield. And furthermore, out of all the historical records that depict important battles throughout history, from the Warring State all the way to the Qing Dynasty, I don't remember any particular important battle where wrestling has played an important role in winning that battle. And based on this lack of evidence, we can actually pretty much come up with a conclusion that maybe troops did train wrestling in the back in the days, but it definitely isn't something that's very important. The soldiers can basically do what's always out there. It's not really going to change the outcome of the battlefield. Of course, one could argue that I did not look through all the records. So again, if you have any better records, you're welcome to send them to me and I'll check them out. But keep in mind that I did look through the evidence that the other camps usually provide, meaning the people who insist that wrestling was very important during the the Chinese olden day battlefield, and the evidence that they provided as historical record are pretty much the two that I've included here, one from the West Zhou Dynasty and one from the Ming Dynasty. And as I've already explained, why those two records are not as strong as these people would like to think. But now, does this mean that we are certain that wrestling isn't important in Chinese olden day military training? Well, you see, here's a thing. The absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence. This is a logical statement that I wholeheartedly support. And what that means is, just because we couldn't find evidence, it doesn't mean there are no evidence or that whatever we're trying to prove does not exist. However, as I explained earlier, if we do not have historical record, and we cannot have archaeological findings, because obviously wrestling is a living heritage, it's not an object or artifact. We can't physically find evidence of that. The only thing that we are left with is use logic, rational thinking, and common sense. And this is precisely what the supporters of wrestling being important in olden day warfare are also trying to use. For example, one of the most common and crucial arguments that those people like to use is that if you look at the Western world, for example, the ancient Greek, ancient Rome, medieval knight, as well as if you look at Japanese feudal samurai period, all of them uses wrestling in their warfare. And if everyone else in the world does that, then China must have done it too, even though we don't actually have very strong, solid evidence to prove it.